Then befell the first sundering of the elves. For the kindred of Ingwe, and the most parts of the kindred of Finwe and Elwe, were swayed by the words of their lords, and were willing to depart and follow Orome. And these were known ever after as the Eldar, by the name that Orome gave the elves in the beginning in their own tongue. But many refused the summons, preferring the starlight and the wide spaces of Middle-earth to the rumour of the trees, and these are the Avari, the unwilling, and they were sundered in that time from the Eldar, and met never again until many ages were past. The Eldar prepared now a great march from their first homes in the east, and they were arrayed in 3 hosts. The smallest host and the first to set forth was led by Ingwe, the most high lord of all the elvish race. He entered into Valinor and sits at the feet of the powers, and all elves revere his name. But he never came back, nor looked again upon Middle-earth. The Vanyar were his people. They are the fair elves, the beloved of Manwë and Varda, and few among men have spoken with them. Next came the Noldor, a name of wisdom, the people of Finwe. They are the Deep-elves, the friends of Aula, and they are renowned in song, for they fought and labored long and grievously in the northern lands of old. The greatest host came last, and they are named the Teleri, for they tarried on the road, and were not wholly of a mind to pass from the dusk to the light of Valinor. In water they had great delight, and those that came at last to the western shores were enamoured of the sea. The Sea-elves, therefore, they became in the land of Aman, the Falmari, for they made music beside the breaking waves. 2 lords they had, for their numbers were great. Elwe Singolo, which signifies grey mantle, and Ulwe, his brother. These were the 3 kindreds of the Eldalia, who passed at length into the uttermost west in the days of the trees, are called the Calaquendi, the elves of the light. But others of the Eldar there were who set out indeed upon the western march, but became lost upon the long road, or turned aside, or lingered on the shores of Middle-earth, and these were for the most part of the kindred of the Teleri, as is told hereafter. They dwelt by the sea, or wandered in the woods and mountains of the world, yet their hearts were turned towards the west. Those elves the Calaquendi called the Úmanyar, since they came never to the land of Aman and the Blessed Realm, but the Úmanyar and the Avari alike they called the Moriquendi, elves of the darkness, for they never beheld the light that was before the sun and moon. Welcome, I'm Professor Rachel Fulton Brown, and this is The Forge of Tolkien. You thought we were done with elves. No, of course you didn't think we were done with elves, but what? You thought I had defined elves for you? Well, no! Now we know that there were many different groups of elves, kindred of elves, lineages of elves. They're the Calaquendi, the Moriquendi. The Calaquendi are divided into the Vanyar, the Noldor, and the Teleri. The Calaquendi, the elves of the light, are distinguished from the Moriquendi, which are called the Avari, but also the Úmanyar. There's a chart, and I have in past years in my own life, right, tried to like draw this chart out more appropriately from the Silmarillion, but simply describe. Well, no, wait. The Teleri, there are 2 groups: some that went to Aman and those who didn't, and some of the Teleri therefore belong not to the Calaquendi but to the Úmanyar. But then some of the Teleri are also Moriquendi because elves. Okay, what is going on here? Why so many categories of elf? Okay, well, I'll repeat them again so that you can start having them in your mind. But you might think that they're the Eldar, but that's not quite the whole group, right? So the Quendi, Quendi, are the elves in general, right? So all of the elves in the stories that Tolkien wrote are called Quendi. And we're going to understand what that name means in a bit. And the 2 major divisions are therefore called Calaquendi and Moriquendi. So Calaquendi, elves of the light, and Moriquendi, elves of the dark, right? So now we have, okay, there's 2 different categories, light and dark. They're all Quendi, but the Calaquendi are the elves of the light, and the Moriquendi are the elves of the darkness, which should make it fairly straightforward, right? Some go to the light, some stay in the dark, and that's that. No, because in the division, right, we have the Vanyar, who are also called the Lindar. I have to have notes for this. I mean, come on, it's like there's no there there's no way I'm doing this off the top of my head. I'm not even sure Tolkien could, right? Because in some of the texts that I'm going to be talking about today, he's giving yet more distinctions and keep changing his mind. You know, his original name for elves was gnomes. Oh, never mind, right? What we're trying to understand is what he's calling in the Silmarillion proper, the Quendi, the elves, right? And we're going to divide them between the Light-elves, the Calaquendi, and the Dark-elves, the Moriquendi. But then the Light-elves, you might think, okay, those are all the blonde ones. No. Did you think all elves had blonde hair? Only some of them have fair hair, and that is technically the Light-elves, the Vanyar, right? They are the fair elves, and so when we say they're the Light-elves, they're not only the ones that, and we're going to get them figure out why they're light and dark elves. They're not only the ones that are light, but they're also the ones that are fair-haired, right? So blonde. But that's only one group of them. Most of the elves, in fact, most of the elves in Tolkien stories, right, both in the Silmarillion and in the Lord of the Rings and also in the Hobbit, they're all dark. They're all dark in the sense that they have dark hair, which is not identical with making them dark elves. All right, you gotta stick with me, or else none of this is gonna make any sense. Okay, so of the Calaquendi, there are Eldar, and they are the elves of the Great Journey, which I will explain. The Vanyar are going to be the ones that are fair-haired, right? So they're the light elves. The Noldor, and I in the opening description that I read to you, we have the lineages, right? The Vanyar are the fair elves; they have light hair. The Noldor, which he says a name of wisdom, they are called the Deep-elves, right? So, or wise, right? So we have the Vanyar, who are the fair, the Noldor, who are the wise, and it helps if you think of the Noldor, the wise elves, the Deep-elves are especially friends of Aula, which will give them a particular characteristic. Remember, Aula is the Valar, the Valar who is particularly concerned with making things, right? So the Noldor are going to be the great craftsmen and particularly associated with Aula. And then we have, confusingly enough, and I'll keep looking at the chart. If you have your copy of the Silmarillion, you can look in this chart at the back. There's the third group of the Eldar, who are the Teleri, and they divide. They're the ones that get really super complicated, right? Because they're both, some of them that go with the Vanyar and the Noldor on the Great Journey and end up in Valinor, right? And those go to Aman. Those are of the Teleri. But then there are others of the Teleri, the sort of latecomers, right? The Sea-elves that never go to Aman, to Valinor, and they are the Sindar, the gray elves, to the sort of the twilight elves, the Sindarin. They make some progress towards Valinor, but don't make it completely. And this is why, if you may have ever tried to learn Elvish, which is also topical for this episode, there are two different languages, right? Kinyan, which is the Elvish, right? And Sindarin, which is also Elvish. But Sindarin is the language of the Teleri who stay in Middle-earth. But then there are further Teleri that make it part of the way and never go any further, and they are called the Nondor. They're the turned back, right? The green elves, right? So we have gray elves and green elves, and they're also called Calaquendi, the green elves of Assyrian. And these are grouped, the Sindar and the Nondor, or the Calaquendi, are called Úmanyar. So they're Eldar, but they don't go to Aman, subcategory. And these Eldar are all contrasted with the Avari, right? We had in our opening statement that there were those elves that were the unwilling, right, who never make a journey at all. And they, together with the Nondor, are called the Moriquendi, the Dark Elves. That's all really clear still, right? Okay, so the point of today's episode is to figure out why Tolkien went to so much effort to make all of these different gradations of elves, right? Isn't it sufficient just to say they're elves and they live a long time, they are, immortal in their lifetimes within Arda, within the created world. They're particularly in love with beauty and craftsmanship, and they have fairly limited dealings with men, and that makes them mysterious and cool. Well, no. Why? Right. Well, it will help, I think, to give you a little bit more sort of backstory, as it were, on the how they come to be breaking up into these different groups in the first place, right? And it's interesting that in the there is a short version of all of this long story that I'm about to tell you. In fact, in The Hobbit, right? And if you're wondering sorry, this is one of those reference heavy episodes, so I'm going to keep losing my place. I better put a mark in that one. Okay. Who the Moriquendi are, or the more particularly the Quendi. If you've read The Hobbit, you've already met them, right? Because those are Quendi, or the Nondor, the green elves, right? As it were. Let me make sure I have that right. The green elves. They're the elves that you meet in Mirkwood in the forest, right? They're the Wood-elves. So one of the categories that Tolkien is trying to work with here, he's got Wood-elves, and the Wood-elves are the ones that the dwarves and Bilbo encounter in Mirkwood when they've kept interrupting all their feasts, right? So the feasting people, he says, were the Wood-elves, of course. Like, okay, fine, they're in the woods. And remember that we figured out that Elrond in The Hobbit isn't an elf. He's an elf friend. And the elves that we met in Rivendell or near Rivendell are more likely to be Sindarin elves, although Tolkien's not really explaining it. All of the ones that you meet in The Hobbit are therefore of these Moriquendi, right? The darker elves. And that doesn't mean they're evil, all right? That's really significant here. It just means they're not of the light in the same way as the Calaquendi are. But anyway, in The Hobbit you meet these Wood-elves. These are not wicked folk, right? And light is going on, something else is going on here other than just good and evil, right? We're calling them light and dark, and that matters. The feasting people were Wood-elves, of course. These are not wicked folk. If they have a fault, it is distrust of strangers, right? It's like we said that these are the ones that didn't want to go on this journey that we're going to find out about. Though their magic was strong, even those days they were wary, right? They differed from the high elves of the West, right? So if you don't understand what's going on in The Hobbit, if you don't understand the Silmarillion from what you learn in The Hobbit, it's because The Hobbit has nothing to do with the story that shows up in the Silmarillion, because they're different elves, right? The Wood-elves differed from the high elves of the West and were more dangerous and less wise, right? So there is a kind of gradation of something, right? But they're not wicked. For most of them, together with their scattered relations in the hills and mountains, were descended from the ancient tribes that never went to Fairy in the West, right? That's the simple version of it. There's some elves that went to Fairy. Wait, I thought the elves were all from Fairy. Right. Tolkien is even like distinguishing the degree to which his own characters travel to Fairy, right? And here in The Hobbit, the Wood-elves don't go to Fairy in the West. They're Fairy in the West, which we're going to learn about in a moment. The Light-elves, those are the Vanyar, right? The blonde ones. And the Deep-elves, those are the Noldor, the wise ones. And the Sea-elves, some of the Teleri, but not all of them, went and lived for ages, and grew fairer and wiser and more learned, and invented their magic and their cunning craft in the making of beautiful and marvelous things, before some came back into the wide world. Okay, so that encapsulated in The Hobbit is the story of the Silmarillion. There's Light-elves, Deep-elves, and Sea-elves that go and live in Fairy for ages, come back with lots of learning, and making beautiful and marvelous things. In the wide world, the Wood-elves lingered in the twilight of our sun and moon, but loved best the stars. Aha! Okay, so now we're starting to get some sense of the light that they're associated with has to do with the sun and the moon and the stars. Good. And they wandered in the great forests that grew tall in lands that are now lost. They dwelt most often by the edges of the woods from which they could escape at times to hunt, or to ride and run over the open lands by moonlight or starlight. Okay, so it's the sun and the moon and the stars that have something to do with the light and the elves' association with them. And these wood-elves are particularly in love with the starlight, right? And after the coming of men, they took ever more and more to the gloaming and the dusk. Still, elves they were and remain, and that is good people. Okay, so we've got some more clues. We know that we've met all of these different categories of the elves, even in The Hobbit, although we've only met the wood elves, in fact, right, and some of the Teleri, and that in the backstory of The Hobbit, there's this other place that's fairy, and the Light-elves, the Deep-elves, and the Sea-elves went there. Okay, where is that? Where is that? Well, this is the setup in the Silmarillion, and it's interesting. If you've ever tried to read the Silmarillion and failed, you've probably stumbled about at this point, because you've gotten to the point where you had the stories of the creation, right? We've had the Ainur who've entered into the world and become the Valar, and we've had the gods and goddesses named, and they've engaged in making things, and Aula has made the dwarves, and we're there, right? And then we get to chapter 3 of the coming of the elves and the captivity of Melkor, and suddenly the story gets really, at least when I read the Silmarillion, it's like sort of vague, and why is it so complicated to get these elves on stage, right? Like we've got the Valar, they're living in the light of the trees beyond the mountains of Aman, but Middle Earth is in fact still just under starlight, right? It's very confusing because you don't have the sun and the moon yet, right? All we have are the light of the trees, who Yavanna is sung into being after the lamps are cast down, right? This sort of, it's a story of light. You're starting to get this, right? It's like we've had the lamps and they've been cast down, so now we have the trees, which I talked about a few episodes ago, right? And they're giving off their light, but Middle Earth itself is still all basically in darkness, right? And in fact, because it's basically all in darkness, there are stuff isn't growing very much, right? All again is dark. There's dark creatures, and during this time, Melkor goes off into Middle Earth and builds his fortress, Sutumno, right? So he gathers demons about him, makes Balrogs, and then he has another stronghold called Angband that's commanded by Sauron. We're sort of setting up for a new conflict, right? And the Valar are waiting for something, right? And they're starting to get a little impatient. Okay. Think back to what happened when they were still Ainur and they were singing, right? We had back in the Ainulindale the fact that there were different musics that come into the theme that Iluvatar proposes, and that the Ainur, help sing and help in the creation of the music. And it seemed to them that they have these different themes. The third theme grew amidst the confusion. It was unlike the others. For first it seemed soft and sweet, a mere rippling of gentle sounds and indelicate melodies, but it could not be quenched and took to itself power and profundity. And it seemed at last there were two musics, and the one was deep and wide and beautiful, but slow and blended with an immeasurable sorrow from which its beauty chiefly came. I hope I've not lost my place in which one of the musics is which. Yes, this third theme is dual, but not for the reasons that he was just saying. That there's this third theme that the Ainur themselves are not they're not part of, right? Because this third theme is propounded by Iluvatar, and with this third theme, they're promised children, right? And what's confusing, of course, is the children are not just what we think of as children of God, right? Men. It's both the elves and the men. Now, the children of the Iluvatar are elves and men, the firstborn, and the followers. The Ainur know about this. The Valar are there in Arda. They've set themselves up beyond the mountains of Aman, and there's no children yet, right? And they're wondering, right? They're hoping for them, and saying, when is it going to happen, right? When is it going to come to us? Ivana spoke before the Valar, saying, "Ye mighty of Arda, the vision of Iluvatar was brief and soon taken away, so that maybe we cannot guess within a narrow count of days the hour appointed. Yet be sure of this, the hour approaches, and within this age our hope shall be revealed, and the children shall awake." And then they wonder what to do about that, right? This is Ivana. "Shall we then leave the lands of their dwelling desolate and full of evil? Shall they walk in darkness while we have light? Shall they call Melkor Lord, while Manwë sits upon Tanikitil?" Melkor is out there. He's built himself a fortress. He's got his demons and Balrogs, and they're taking over Middle-earth, while the Valar are living in their city, right? And they're starting to worry. And this is actually very interesting that Tolkien's setting it up this way. That the Valar are about to make a choice. They're about to make a very important decision. And there's a question of whether, I mean, they're supposed to be like, the angels, the gods. They're whether they make the right decision based on their role in creation, right? Their role in helping Iluvatar with the making of things. Okay. They're waiting for this new theme to arise, and they are expecting these children to show up, but they don't know who they are and they don't know where they're going to be, and they're worried, right? And so Varda does a great making and recognize right now Middle-earth is in darkness. There's the two trees, but there's dark over the rest of the creation. It's like it helps just say Arda, because if you say the earth or the globe, obviously you're in complicated terms because it's still flat at this point. And where in Middle-earth these things are going on is a little unclear, because Tolkien never quite mapped this in like drawings. In any case, so Varda, with Manwë decides that the children of Iluvatar shall come indeed, but they come not yet. And what will happen for them first, or at least this is simply declared, is they'll first look upon the stars. There are no stars yet, so Varda has to go make some, right? So Varda goes forth, began a great labor, greatest of all the works of the Valar since their coming into Arda. She took the silver dews from the vats of Telperion, that's one of the trees, and therewith she made new stars, and brighter against the coming of the firstborn. Wherefore she whose name out of the deeps of time and the labors of Ea was Tintala, the kindler, and was called after by the elves Elantari, queen of the stars. So it's dark. Manwë says the firstborn are about to come, but they're going to awake basically in darkness. And interestingly, but it's like now thinking about this out loud, it's unclear to me whether the Valar are making the right decision even at this point. Whether maybe it was Iluvatar's purpose that the elves awake into complete darkness, but the Valar are saying no, we should give them some light, right? So we're going to give them just the stars, just the starlight, right? And so Varda, who's Elbereth eventually, makes a variety of stars. She makes also some constellations, including, interestingly, Minal Makar with his shining belt, so Orion, right? She makes that constellation. that forebodes the last battle that shall be at the end of days. And high in the north, as a challenge to Melkor, she set the crown of 7 mighty stars to swing, Valakirka, the sickle of the valor and sign of doom. That's Ursa Major. So she's setting up. I mean, it's like the sky clock that Owen likes talking about, right? That here in the Silmarillion, Varda makes it, and it is there as a sign of doom. It's the sign of the Valar to circle round the pole star. So that this is very important for the meaning of elves, right? When the firstborn and the firstborn of the firstborn, when the firstborn of the children, the elves, awake, the first thing they see are stars. It is told that even as Varda entered her labors, and they were long, when first Minilmakar strode up in the sky, and the blue fire of Helluin flickered in the mists above the borders of the world, in that hour the children of the earth awoke, the firstborn of Iluvatar. It's interesting they just awake, right? It's so curious. Tolkien in his stories never has an actual genesis for human beings. They sort of show up in the story, and the elves go, "Where are you from?" we have though the in the Silmarillion the telling of the awakening of the elves. There's again curiously they're children of Iluvatar, but he doesn't come down and craft them in any way, right? We had earlier Aula making the dwarves, and it's clearly some kind of work of craftsmanship. Here the elves simply wake up, and I mean now we're into heavy metaphor. Okay, we haven't figured that out, right? That all they open their eyes, right? They wake up by the starlit mirror of Cuivienen, the water of awakening. They rose from the sleep of Iluvatar, and while they slept yet silent by Cuivienen, I'm sorry, I haven't practiced saying this enough. Cuivienen, their eyes beheld first of all the stars of heaven. Therefore they have ever loved the starlight and have revered Varda Elentari above all the Valar. It's not an accident that all of the elvish songs in The Lord of the Rings are to Varda, right? She's Elbereth, Starkindler, and basically the elves, because the first thing they see at the water awakening, remember Tolkien's Catholic no matter what, they awaken their eye by the waters and they can see. Now I am definitely, I'm not thinking allegorically in any of these things, but once we've been talking in a variety of ways about the sacraments that Tolkien has just basically ground into his imagination regardless, right? If the elves wake up at water that gives them sight and light, and the first thing they see is a star, and it's a lady star, I'm suspicious, right? There's a degree of baptismal imagery here, and if you know about the sacrament of baptism and the way in which it's understood, for example, actually thinking about it right now, I'm recording this right after Easter, and the catechumens are baptized in the candlelight, right? There's all sorts of, okay, I did not plan this. I'm just thinking of it right now. There's other stuff that I'm doing with light and things like that. I did just say water, baptism, light, awakening, stars. If you've been to a baptism, particularly Catholic baptism, there's the water that you put a candle in, and the candle is then given to the catechumens as a symbol of the light into which they are now reborn. Okay, the elves wake up and are baptized, sort of within a moment of baptism, and these are the firstborn. The birth in water of awakening has got to be intentional, or everything Tolkien does is intentional, but at what level he's intending it is always challenging, right? Because this sort of sacramental imagery just is so shot through everything. Okay, so they love the starlight, and of course, if they love Varda, and we'll talk. I do one day have to do an actual Marian episode, but the Virgin Mary in Catholic and medieval meditations is Stella Maris. She's Star of the Sea. There is zero way that Varda as Star Kindler doesn't have a Marian element to her in Tolkien's imagining. So the elves wake up, the first thing they see are the stars, and they fall in love with the lady. Okay. Now, and it's also they wake up in the midst of water, and the first sound that they heard was the sound of water flowing, and the sound of water flowing over stone. So there's this sort of musical element too. But if you have in Tolkien stories always the elves is very strongly associated with water, this is why. Okay. And this is how we think about them as Quendi. They start talking. Okay. Long they dwelt in their first home by the water under stars, and they walked the earth in wonder, and they began to make speech, and to give names to all things that they perceived. Now this, of course, makes them Adam-like, right? Because, of course, in Genesis, what God does is he brings all the animals to Adam and says, name them. I'm still reading John C. Wright's Green Knight Squire, and he has a lovely trope in the story where the fairy creatures don't have names unless a son of Adam has named them. It's interesting that what Tolkien is therefore making his elves, again, different from Wright's elves, participants in this naming exercise, so that the elves can name things, and they name themselves. Themselves they name the Quendi, signifying those that speak with voices. For as yet they met no other living thing that spoke or sang. So they speak, they name things, they name themselves speakers. Quendi is, elves are those who speak, right? So now we have water, light, speech. They're there by the lake, and the Valar are still hoping to know about them, but they apparently don't get like a notice. Iluvatar doesn't tell the Valar, oh, go, by the way, those children you've been waiting for, they woke up. Orome, the hunter, finds them, right, which is and as it were by chance. I'm trying to figure this out, right, because the Valar have enough knowledge of the plan of Iluvatar to be expecting the children, but they have no knowledge of where the elves are going to be. And when Orome finds them, he's out there riding on his white horse, his great white horse. He's the monster hunter, right? He's the hunter of monsters and fell beasts, and he has a great horse, Nahar, and a magnificent horn that he blows when he's hunting. And he basically stumbles upon them. Right. Thus it was the Valar found at last, as it were by chance, those who they had so long awaited. It's because his horse neighs, right? The Nahar sets up a great neighing and stood still, and Orome wondered and sat silent, and it seemed to him that in the quiet of the land under the stars he heard far off many voices singing. So Orome hears the elves singing, his horse, alerts him to it, and now the Valar know that the elves have awoken, and he goes and talks to them. And he falls in love with them. Orome loves the Quendi and names them after their own tongue, Eldar, the people of the stars, right? So if the Eldar are, well, it should be the Eldar and the Avari should all be, Quendi should all be Eldar, so I don't okay. Eldar means people of the stars, and that's because Orome, using the Elvish language, names them. And then the Valar get worried, right? Because the elves are all they're basically all there by themselves, and remember Melkor and his demons are out there in Middle-earth, and the Valar are concerned whether Melkor is going to get to the Quendi. And in fact, Melkor does. He sort of sends evil spirits and shadows to spy upon them and lead them astray and so forth. And so some of the Quendi, recognizing this, don't themselves trust Orome either, right? It's like he's saying, so it came to pass some years ere the coming of Orome that if any of the elves strayed far abroad, alone or together, they would often vanish. And so when Orome shows up, they're not sure whether or not even to trust him, right? And remember what in The Hobbit, the Wood-elves were particularly wary, right? That the elves become wary from the beginning because there is Melkor sending his spirits in to lead them astray and kidnap them, as it were. But some of them had particular courage, and when they saw Orome, they see the light of Aman in his face, and all the noblest of the elves were drawn towards it, right? So here Orome shows up. All thus far the elves have seen is starlight, and now Orome with his white horse is glowing, right? That they can see the light, not no longer just of the stars, but of the trees, basically, shining in Orome's face. The ones that Melkor lured away probably are what became orcs. We'll have an episode on orcs at some point, but they are drawn even further into darkness and never behold the light on Orome's face. Now the Valar have an even bigger debate, right? First they were worrying about when to expect the children, and now that they know the firstborn have awoken and some of them have met Orome, they have a debate about whether or not they should help them. and this I find it's the sort of degree to which the Valar are allowed to interfere in Ilúvatar's music making is interesting, because of course remember the thing that Melkor did that was evil, if we consider Melkor specifically evil, right, and his envy and his desire to make his own stuff, was to interfere in the music and try to make his own themes, right? And now the Valar, knowing that Ilúvatar proposed this third theme of the children, which has its two strands, the elves and the men, was not part of their singing, and now they're wanting to like bug it, get into it themselves. Tolkien's already showing you how complicated the problem is, right? The Valar want to protect the elves. They set a guard over the Waters of Awakening, Cuivianen, and then had a big fight with Melkor, right? And in this contest, the overthrow of Utumno, the Quendi don't know what's going on. The Valar basically protect them from it, and all they know is there's like earthquakes and like tsunamis. The water's removed and lights of a mighty fires, right? It's the sort of cataclysms of the land and the water. And Utumno is overthrown, although they don't manage to capture Sauron, so he's still out there. And Melkor is at this point chained up, and he's there for some ages, right? He's going to get out in the future, right? But in the early days for the elves, the Valar have come in and basically brought them under their protection by way of fighting off Melkor. And then again, they gather in council, and they're divided in debate. For some, and those Ulmo was the chief, held that the Quendi should be left free to walk as they would in Middle-earth, and with their gifts of skill to order all the lands and heal their hurts. But the most part feared for the Quendi in the dangerous world amidst the deceits of the starlight dusk, and they were filled, moreover, with the love of the beauty of the elves, and desired their fellowship. At the last, therefore, the Valar summoned the Quendi to Valinor, there to be gathered at the knees of the powers in the light of the trees forever, And Mandos broke his silence, saying, "So it is doomed." From this summons came many woes that afterwards befell. The Valar, and this when I teach this class, this is in my campus course. This is one of the sort of first great choices that we realize we're coming up against in Tolkien stories, right? That the Valar have a debate. Ulmo, the Valar of the waters, right, the seas, is saying, no, we really should leave them alone to develop themselves and their skills. They can work in the lands and heal the land themselves, and it's really not appropriate for us to be bringing them here. The other Valar say they want the elves with them in Valinor. They want the Quendi with them in Valinor and to share with them the light of the trees. And so they contact the elves and bring them to Valinor. Now, this is so interesting because in The Hobbit we realize that Valinor is basically fairy, right? So the Valar are inviting the elves to come to fairy, and therefore putting the elves themselves in peril by inviting them to fairy. I mean, Tolkien is digging himself into all sorts of theoretical difficulties here for a purpose, right? I think he is trying to explore something, some kind of danger. Would it have been better if the Valar simply left the elves around the Lake of Awakening, the Waters of Awakening, and never showed them there was more light, right? Because that is in fact what happens. So the Valar summon the elves to Valinor, and the elves are at first unwilling, for as yet they'd only seen the Valar in their wrath as they went to war, except for Orome, who's they've seen on his horse, right? And they're afraid. So Orome is sent to them and brings back 3 ambassadors, Ingwe, Finwë, and Elwë. Those 3 go to Valinor, and they're like overawed by how beautiful it is, right? They were filled with awe by the glory and majesty of the Valar and desired greatly the light and splendor of the trees. Then Orome brought them back to Cuavianen, and they spoke before their people and counseled them to heed the summons of the Valar and remove to the west. And this is how we end up with this sundering, right? It's the Valar's doing that they have a debate and they invite the elves to come to live under the light of the trees, and some of the elves say yes and come with them, and some of the elves say yes and come with them instantly, right? So those are going to become the Vanyar, the people of Ingwe, and they just stay in Valinor, now, right? They're still there, and men typically don't see them, and so there's some of the elves just stay and they live in the light. No longer the trees, because the trees have been killed, but they get to live in the light of Valinor for the existence of Arda, right? The Noldor, the Deep-elves, the Friends of Ally come, and they stay for some time, but then it's going to be their adventures that we really hear about in the Silmarillion, because they're the ones who make the Silmarils, or at least Fëanor is. And they spend some time in Valinor, but then leave. Complicated. And then the various groups of the Teleri, some come later, live close to the light of the trees, but not within it in the same way the Noldor and the Vanyar do. And then other elves, like the Sindar, led by Thingol, who is in fact Lúthien's father. I hope that's right. Please let me be right when I do these things off the top of my head without triple checking everything. I'm just gonna let you be absorbing this. Yes, she's daughter of Thingol. And the Maya, Melian. Thingol stays. He leaves the Waters Awakening, but he stays in Middle Earth and stays basically in the Twilight, right? And it's his people whose language becomes Sindarin, right? So it's not therefore associated with Valinor at all. And then there are the Dark Elves who basically either never make it across the Great River Anduin and stay in the Greenwood, right, in Mirkwood, or they basically just vanish from the stories completely. The Avari, the totally unwilling, that may still be living there by the waters of Cuivinen. Somebody can tell me how to say that. Again, why, right? Why is Tolkien putting us through all of these sunderings of the elves? And you might say at this point, well, which are the true elves, right? Are the elves, the truest elves, the ones that go and live in the light of the trees and never want to leave the company of the Valar? Or are they the ones that distrusted the Valar in the first place and never left the lake where they woke up, right? Are they the ones who were somewhat, I mean, it's like you get these twilight elves of various sorts, right? The Sindar or the Nondor, the Sindar or the Nondor go partly on the journey, but not really, stick around. What is Tolkien doing with all these different categories? Well, let's go back to, let me make sure I can put this, get my thoughts in order here. Let's go back to the point of what elves were in the first place, right? And we're saying they're Quendi. They're the ones who speak. If you're a true Tolkien fan, right, you don't just want to be an elf and trying to figure out what the elves are. It's like, okay, they wake up under the stars, they go to the light, and some of them are blonde, but not all of them, and some of them are, have close associations with the gods, and others are fearful of them. What do they all have in common that makes them, in fact, all elves? Speech, right? I mean, truly, and here is where I am pathetic as a Tolkien fan, because I really don't speak any of the Elvish languages. But the point is, it's the languages, right? If you're a true Tolkien, if you're truly absorbed into his stories, if you're truly participating in this mystery that he's trying to show us, you want to be able to speak Elvish. Which one? And then I think we start seeing, it's like so there's light and there's speech. And remember, they're both Eldar, the star people, but they're also Quendi, the ones who speak. And then we're starting to get closer to the mystery that Tolkien's actually playing with here. And I think, let's see, I've got several pieces for you, right? Which one should I tell you first? Well, I'm speechless. Okay, there are three pieces of the problem. One is in Mythopoeia and the description of humanity's ability to make things. One piece is the Lamas, which is a history of the languages of creation. And one is the book that I've entitled this episode according to, which is Verlyn Flieger's absolutely magnificent study of Tolkien's understanding of language, which he calls Splintered Light. And it's the convergence of these three pieces that I need you to be able to understand. Let's remind ourselves of the poem first, and it's particularly one particular stanza. Remember Mythopoeia? It's the poem I talked about way back at the beginning of these videos in episode 3, where Tolkien is making his argument to Lewis about why myth matters, right? But there's this very important stanza that gives us the mystery that Tolkien is trying to explain of humanity's place in creation, right? The heart of man is not compound of lies, but draws some wisdom from the only wise and still recalls him. So we are in some association with the wise, capital. Though now long estranged, man is not wholly lost nor wholly changed. Disgraced he may be, yet is not dethroned, and keeps the rags of lordship once he owned, his world dominion by creative act, not his to worship the great artifact, capital artifact, man, subcreator, the refracted light, through whom is splintered from a single white to many hues, and endlessly combined in living shapes that move from mind to mind. Though all the crannies of the world we filled with elves and goblins, though we dared to build gods and their houses out of dark and light, and sow the seed of dragons, 'twas our right, used or misused. The right has not decayed, we make still by the law in which we're made. Now, that should give you lots of things chiming off when you're here. We're talking about the wise, which is what the Noldor were supposed to be, right? They're the Deep-elves, the wise elves, the ones who learn from Aula how to make things. So they, in fact, I mean, they have the main role in the Silmarillion because Fëanor makes the Silmarils, okay? And he's one of the Noldor. But this making in the image and likeness in which we are made, man, subcreator, he's not made to worship creation, he's not made to worship the created world, the great artifact. But he is, not his to worship the great artifact, man subcreator, the refracted light, through whom is splintered from a single white is capitalized, too many hues, and endlessly combined in living shapes that move from mind to mind. That is Tolkien's description of our artistic work. Right? Now, remember that what we were trying to understand about the elves is why they're great artists, right? And that will be always the thing that Tolkien says about the elves, right? He says, the doom of the elves, they're the firstborn, the doom of the elves is to be immortal, to love the beauty of the world, to bring it to full flower with their gifts of delicacy and perfection, to last while it lasts. Never, that's in the sense that they're immortal. They last as long as the world lasts. Never leaving it even when slain, but returning, and yet when the followers come, that's human beings, to teach them and make way for them to fade as the followers grow and absorb the life from which they both proceed. So the doom of the elves is to love the beauty of the world and to bring it to full flower with their gifts. Now, remember that when the Valar are debating about whether or not to go get the Eldar, the Star Children, Ulmo says we should leave them to their own craft, basically, right? And the others say, no, we want them with us. And some of the elves don't come, right? So basically everybody gets their wish in certain fashion. But the elves are made to participate in the making themselves, to love the beauty of the world. But they're obviously also an image of our own human ability to be creative, to be subcreated. And so something's going on. What's this refracted light? What's this splintering from a single white to many hues and endlessly combined? The elves are showing us something about art and therefore about our relationship as creatures to the great artist. How does that work, right? Okay, that's one piece. So question, artifact, splintering of light, subcreation, we make still in the image in which we are made, right? We make still by the law in which we're made. That right is not decayed. This is what the whole of Tolkien's legendarium is always trying to show us, something about our relationship to the creator. Okay. Second piece of the puzzle. This is the Lammas, which is an account of tongues, and it's supposed to have been written down by Pengalod of Gondolin, wrote afterwards in Teleri, using in part the work of Rumo, the sage of Cure. Remember, when all of these sort of elvish storytellers are there in the background in Tolkien's record keeping, I suppose, of where the stories are coming from. And here we have an account of, in fact, where the elves get their language, right? Now, here what's interesting is that they, in the Silmarillion, we had them simply starting to speak, right? They wake up and they began to make speech and give names to all things that they perceived. Anytime Tolkien talks about naming, we're in significant Genesis space, right? Well, of the Valiant tongue and its descendants, from the beginning the Valar had speech, the gods speak. And after they came into the world, they wrought their tongue for the naming and glorifying of all things therein. Naming again. Adam names all the animals, right? So if anything that we're doing in the stories has to do with naming, I want your bells to be going off and saying, okay, so we're in some kind of intimate relationship with the Creator, and the naming is the great magic, right? The adjective is the great magic word. In after ages, at their appointed time, the Quendi, who are also the elves, awoke beside Cuivianen, the waters of awakening, under the stars in the midst of Middle-earth. There they were found by Orma, lord of the forests, and of him they learned after their capacity the speech of the Valar. And all the tongues that have been derived thence may be called Oromian or Quendian. Orome teaches them the divine language, right? Or divine in the sense of the whatever the divinity that the Valar have, right? Because the Orome comes and finds the Eldar, as he calls them, the starred people, he teaches them to speak the Valar's speak. And at this point, in the Tale of the Tongues, Tolkien is actually, and he makes some lovely this is in The Lost Road and Other Writings, which is 5, right? You realize how much passive stuff I have and how I have to triple check all the details every time I talk to you guys. So therefore appreciate the ones I get right when I'm saying them. These language trees, right? These are trees of language. In Tolkien's original imagining, all language is divine, right? And this is what's very interesting, that the Valar give the various languages. Melkor gives the language to the orcs. Alla gives his language to the dwarves, and Orome, the Lord of the Hunt, right, the Lord of the Forest, gives the language to the elves. Now, I obviously Tolkien revises and rethinks and is like, okay, do the elves have their own language just because they're children of Iluvatar and they wake up and they can speak? I mean, the sort of primary thing that Tolkien is playing with and wondering about is basically the origin of language. Always, right? He said he wrote these stories to give histories in which the languages could have a point, right? Have a reality. And so his elvish stories, all of the elvish stories are also basically language trees, right? So if we have things like the Vanyar and the Noldor and the Teleri, who are the Calaquendi, and then the Sindar and the Nondor and the Avari, who are the Moriquendi, all of this is in fact folding into Tolkien's underpinning for everything. It's always going to be philological, and it's always going to be about his understanding of the way language works. And what he's trying to show you here in the Lamas is the divisions of language that the elves are the different kindred of the elves develop. He says that the speech of the Valar changes little, but when the elves learn it, they start adapting it, right? The speech of the Valar changes little, for the Valar do not die, and before the sun and the moon it altered not from age to age in Valinor. But when the elves learned it, Orme teaches them the Valar language, they changed it from the first in the learning and softened its sounds, and they added many words to it of their own liking, and devices even from the beginning. the elves love the making of words, and this has ever been the chief cause of the change of variety of their tongues. Elves are the ones who speak. I mean, they may be star children, as Orme calls them, but they're the ones who speak, and they love languages, and so each of their kindred develops their own particular, as they say, tongues, right? They're sort of dialects, and it's, when Tolkien talks about it, the Quenya, which is the Elvish speak, right? The Valar Elvish speak, sort of highest version of it is the Elf Latin, and Sindarin is the sort of more daily speech, and the Sindarin is what the elves in Middle Earth who live there, with Thingol and the Wood-elves and such, that's what they speak. But even in Valinor, the elves get divided up into different dialects, right? So the Lindar or the Noldor, the Vanyar, the fair, the Noldor, the wise, the Teleri, the latest to awake, and they end up with different tongues, right, and different emphases. And the longer they live in Valinor, the more they alter the tongue of the Valar, and each of the kindreds alter it after their own fashion, right? Okay, so first piece, creativity, relationship to God as creator, splintering of light, artifact. Second thing, language, creation. Why do we have all those different elvish kindred? Right, because we could just say, okay, the Valar get them, they all bring them. It's like, what's the point of having them splinter, right? And realize that this is not my insight. This is totally Flieger's insight, because she's very deeply learned in the understanding of mythology. Like, truly unmatched in my knowledge in Tolkien scholarship for her insight into the structure of Tolkien storytelling. So I do refer to her a lot, and this is the episode that I really wanted to introduce you to her deepest insight, I think, is this, that she sees in the Silmarillion and the Elvish stories generally what Tolkien achieved, the way Tolkien achieved what he describes in Mythopoeia as the story of the splintering of the light, and the meaning of having the single light of Iluvatar, as it were, the wisdom of the only lies, splintered into all of these different hues of elvish people, right? So we have the Vanyar, who are very light, the Noldor, who are darker, the Teleri, who are more sea colory, the Sindar, who are twilight and gray, the Nondor, who are more green, and then the dark, right? It's basically the rainbow, right? And the elves participate in this rainbow. They're not leprechauns, don't worry about that. Or they maybe deep in his understanding they're leprechaun-y, but he's basically trying to make a story about the rainbow and showing the elves going from their waters of awakening to the land of the trees, the light. And then, of course, what they're going to have to do is come back from the light. And so the great travels of the elves are from the darkness under the stars to the light of the trees in Valinor. And then once we have the Silmarils, which we're getting to the point where we can talk about why they make sense for all of this imagery, right? Basically, think about a Silmaril. It's a diamond. And think about what diamonds do, right? They refract all of the light so that it shines out like in all of these rainbow hues. The reason the Silmarils become the centerpiece of the elvish stories, because they're a symbol of what elves do as a people of Iluvatar, and therefore, in fact, what human beings do is we make even more beautiful the white light as it is refracted through us into creation. Now, if any of you have ever read my book on books on Mary, and particularly my Mary in the Art of Prayer, you realize this is also a Marian image, right? So we've just had the elves wake up under the stars, and they are therefore forever devoted to Varda, the lady, the Stella Maris, the star of the sea. one of the great mysteries of the incarnation, one of the most beautiful ways that the mystery of the incarnation is described, is as Mary is a crystal through which the light of the divinity shines and takes on form and becomes incarnate. I've talked about this recently. Now I can't remember whether I've told you all before. Well, I'm giving you new context if I've talked about it before here, right? That think about, for example, the windows in the great cathedrals in medieval Europe, right? The rose windows, all that colored glass that the light shines through and basically becomes incarnate thereby, right? Because it falls on the pavement in the cathedrals in different colors, right? If you imagine, therefore, the Silmarils have this characteristic, right? If the light shines through them, they refract it. Think of that Pink Floyd cover, right, with the prism. So we're taking the white light and refracting it into the rainbow color, and it's whatever the spectrum is. The white contains all of it, and you see the more beautiful white because you can see all of its different hues once it's been refracted in that way. Likewise with the refracting of the light of God through the crystal, the Virgin Mary, so it's sort of the star image, right, into the world, becomes incarnate, takes on flesh, becomes visible by way of entering through her into the world. The incarnational mystery is very, very deep. Oh wait, and the elves speak, right? So this is why it's like you have to get all of these pieces together to get to the point that this makes sense. And Flieger has been setting this all up. She's been explaining the way in which Tolkien is thinking in terms of the making, our right to subcreate, making in that law. She's saying the subcreative process is now the splintering or dividing and recombining of light to create the living shapes that move from mind to mind. Whereas there's a prose passage where he explains it too, whereas the prose passage is simply the combining of words and incantatory use of adjectives in a mythical grammar. Remember when I talked about magic, we talked about adjectives and saying the mystery of language is the ability to name things again, and now it's this mystery of the splintering of light so that it moves from mind to mind, right? Well, Tolkien had been thinking about all of this very deeply through his friend Owen Barfield's work. And I've mentioned this already. I got some interesting comments on Facebook when I shared the blurb for that episode. And I was saying, the mystery of the Trinity is shown through the Valar. Well, I meant because Manwë and the way Manwë is somehow both breath and spirit. Right, we'll get Manwë in here. Because he's breather as well as speaker, right? Remember, Manwë, the chief of the Valar, this is Flieger's reading, is Lord of the Earth and is Eru's deputy. His epithet is Sulimo, the breather, and he is master of the airs and winds, Lord of the airs of art of the world. Both in function and by epithet, that is, as he is perceived, Manwë thus encompasses all the ancient meanings of spiritus and noema, cited by Barfield, breath, wind, and spirit. Do you remember that? Go back and listen to that episode. It's like the breath of the gods, right? So the breath of the gods is is Tolkien's use of Barfield's understanding that language in this... Sorry, I've lost my place again. Language in its ancient first speak. It's like, how do you say it? It's like the elves the elves wake up and start naming things, right? And so the beginnings of speech are deep in all of Tolkien's imagining. It's like, where does it come from? Where does our ability to speak come from? The mystery of language in the first place. And obviously, therefore, because we are speaking in so many different languages all the time, why there are so many different languages. Remember, so I showed you the splintered light and the creativity and the passing from mind to mind, right? That image of making by the law in which we're made somehow is this refracting of the wisdom of the wise into all of these different expressions. And then his Islamis, his history of languages, he's constantly meditating on, well, why are there multiple languages, right? Those two things have to go together. The splintering, the multiplicity of languages, and presumably its primary origin always in the divine, right? And what Barfield came up with was, he'd been reading Rudolf Steiner, who's been quoted around the internet recently, which is interesting. But Barfield had come to believe that you could find this meaning suffused throughout all of creation, and that the hints of it, the traces of it, were all in the way in which the original words in human language were more integral, I suppose, is the thing. That Barfield had this sense that again, there's this fracturing and splintering and so forth that Tolkien and Barfield are all trying to make sense of. I mean, going back, being concrete in the example is often the best way to do it. Going back to Barfield, the word pneuma, Greek word pneuma, and the Latin word spiritus, originally each expressed a concept in which wind, breath, and spirit were perceived as the same phenomena, right? So as Flieger is going to unpack this for us, I do recommend you read her book if you really like this kind of thing. That what original language has is this blending or unity of the literal and the metaphoric, right? And that the abstract and the concrete were not differentiated in primitive speech. And that what happens historically and becomes myth, right, is this splintering of concept and division between the literal and the concrete. Well, that's a rather heady thought if what your primary text in the description of divinity says is, in the beginning was the word. Right? Translating logos as word and understanding all of the complexities what logos would have meant, right? Word, speech, reason, organizing principle, cosmic harmony. Tolkien is always thinking in Christian terms about the mysteries that he's trying to explain, right? He said that. I'm going to keep saying that. You're just going to have to be okay if you want to keep listening to me. Owen may be talking about the Trinity all the time, even doesn't mean to. I mean to be talking about this all the time, because Tolkien is trying, by way of his stories, always to show you these deep theological mysteries. And in the elves, he is trying to show you the mystery of speech and the kind of contact that it gives us with God, by way of the multiplicity of languages that we have created as human beings, right? And make some way in which that all of that splintering is, part of the beauty of creation. Now, that's literally, I think, literally the opposite of what too many people try to do, which is always trying to find, well, we should know what the language is that God spoke in, right? And there have been experiments over the course of human history, and particularly in the Middle Ages, where, you take kids and raise them without any human beings around and expect them to speak the originary language, right? They're I don't know whether these are apocryphal stories or not. Frederick II trying to do this. That if you somehow don't contaminate our learning with somebody else's speech, we'll figure out what the language of the divine actually was, right? Or you can say, the sort of fetishizing of particular languages. We can think of Arabic, right? Worse, Hebrew. To fetishize particular languages, to say those are the closest to what Adam spoke, because either we have scriptures that were written down in those languages and therefore claim some kind of primacy. Tolkien is radically against that kind of he's always attending speech, he's always attending the word. I mean, the logos is, he's named his main characters the people who speak, right? They call themselves those who speak, right? Those who speak with voices. And yet the mystery that he tries to show through those who speak with voices is it's like counterintuitive, right? We've got the ones who never leave the lake, the waters of awakening, simply under the starlight. They're only under the starlight. The ones that go to Valinor and speak with the Valar, speak with the gods, as it were, learn the divine speech, are not necessarily the good guys. Problematic, right? Because the Noldor among them are the ones that are going to come and bring great destruction on their peoples, that kill some of their kin on the way back to Middle Earth once they go there. And that the elves that stay simply under the starlight or in the green are also participating in that wisdom, right? That, and remember what Tolkien said in the Hobbit, the green elves, the elves of the Greenwood, are not wicked. They're wary, but they're all part of the mystery of the Eldar, right? The ones who woke up under the stars and who speak. And what Tolkien does, as Flieger shows, is unpack the complexity of this mystery of the relationship between speech and understanding by way of the metaphor of the light, right? And she has this wonderful passage, and say, let me see if I can unpack this one for you. It says, both words and light are agents of perception, enabling us to see phenomenon. The word for a thing, the name, governs the way it is perceived and can be said to make us see it. Something instinctive in the use of language reaches for metaphors of light to convey mental as well as physical perception. We clarify an argument. We say we see when we mean we understand. A change in wording can put things in a different light. 3 uses of this kind of metaphor occur in the previous paragraph. This is nothing new. Any study of language will regularly turn up such dead metaphor. The point is that for Tolkien, it is neither dead nor metaphor, it is a living reality. For him, the word, capital word, is light, enlightenment. Everything that Tolkien is trying to achieve with his elves is about fiat lux, let there be light, the word through which the world was created. And he's doing it by way of these characters showing their different relationships between their making and their understanding, their wisdom and their creativity. So that, as Flieger points out, this is mainly to get you to read her book, because I'm not going to be able to summarize all of her insights simply in a single episode. But what she claims, to turn from poetic diction and on fairy stories to the Silmarillion is to go from theory, variously expressed, to practice. Right, so I've suggested to you for episode after episode after episode that there's a theorizing of creativity in Tolkien's On Fairy Stories and Mythopoeia, in things like the Notion Club papers and so forth. We're finally getting 31 episodes in to the heart of his actual practice, and I hope now we have enough to really unpack it all and say this is the Silmarillion is a work of amazing genius, right? Because he's taking something that I would say the great literary theorists have lost their way completely on ever trying to explain, but that is at the heart of the Western tradition, particularly the Christian tradition, of understanding our ability to make stuff. And Tolkien's Silmarillion is going to be an exercise in showing us both the glory and the danger of what that is, what that means, right? So she says, so the Silmarillion is to go from theory to practice, from theory variously expressed to practice. The work is a sweeping legendarium, an imagined mythology with all the familiar mythological characters, elements, and themes: creation and transgression, gods and men, love and war, heroism and doom. You think Amazon is gonna, or Netflix, or whoever is making, they're gonna get? No, I think they're doing the second age anyway. It's Numenor. How would you? I tremble at the idea that modern video writers get this, right? More than anything else, and more than most mythologies, it is a story about light. Images of light in all stages, bright, dim, whole, reflected, clear, or rainbow-hued, pervade the songs and stories of the fictive world. It is a world peopled with sub-creators whose interactions with and attitudes towards the light shape their world and their own destinies within it. Remember, that's the whole point of Orome going and trying to persuade the Eldar, the Quendi, to come with him. They've seen the light of Valinor in his face, and he's trying to persuade them to come, and some of them will come and some of them won't, and they sort of, rainbow-like refract as they're traveling across Middle Earth, so that some of them don't go all the way to the light. Tolkien's treatment of light in the Silmarillion derives its primary image from his Catholicism, its linguistic method from Barfield's theory. So you have to keep in mind, Barfield's poetic diction is always behind all of this, and wind, breath, spirit is the key to reminding yourself. Manwe, wind, breath, spirit. It's that the fracturing of that single unity into abstract and concrete is at the heart of what Tolkien's trying to achieve. Tolkien's approach is to first restore to words their primal unity of concept, with Barfield, and then to set up a progressive fragmentation of both word and percept as these express a changing relationship to the fictive world and a diminishing reflection of its light. His technique is to confer literality on what would in the primary world be called metaphor, and then to illustrate the process by which the literal becomes metaphoric. This is why it's so hard to explain to you what he's doing. It's not allegory, right? It's this making literal of what in the primary world, our world, is metaphor. And then to illustrate the process by which the literal becomes metaphor, right? It goes back and forth. And this, as I read it, and this is what makes Tolkien a medieval author, right? Because medieval commentators on scripture, particularly in the monastic tradition, understood this kind of relationship between history and figure, what we would call, she's calling literal and metaphor, right? It's better described as the events in the story, which then also figure the reality, which is also part of the story, but that is pointing to the relationship between the created and the creator. It's not strictly speaking of being earth and heaven, because heaven's also creature, the creation of God, right? But you are, and it's not just metaphor because it's real in the way in which in the beginning was the Word is real, and that Word was with God and was God, and it was through that Word that everything was created and came into the world. And understanding that, the sort of prime metaphor of enlightenment and wisdom, is at the heart of understanding the Christian mystery, or it's a being within it. But that, if you are able to read these stories of the elves, the people who speak, and their awakening under the starlight, and their movement towards the light, and then they're making a gemstone that refracts the light, and then their pursuit of the light, and the quest for these gemstones that contain the light, over and over and over, it's totally just battering you over the head with his mystery of man, sub-creator, the refracted light, through whom is splintered from a single white to many hues, and endlessly combined in living shapes that move from mind to mind. Which is why it's interesting. So, the definition of elves, going back and back and back, is always about speaking. Those who say things, right? and that this is fundamental to our experience as human beings who are storytellers, right? And this is the last passage I was wanting to share with you from Flieger, where she's saying this: the making still by that law in which we're made is what we are as human beings, right? The elves are the firstborn children, but they're meant to be showing us something about our experience as human beings. And that's why the language is so important, right? That what the elves do is speak, and their sundering is a history of their languages, and their history of their own language, the history of the elvish languages, is a metaphor for the reality of what it is to be human beings with our multiple languages, right? Tolkien loved the power latent in language, that mythological grammar by which humanity can, through its perception and subcreation, bring into being a secondary world. To hear or speak a new language is to be, for the moment, in a new and strange world, created by unfamiliar words, expressing different perceptions and a different imaginative vision, in effect a secondary world, whose colors are refracted through the prism of language. We may say, then, that any world in which human beings live and speak is subcreated by their words and is thus a secondary world. We can never experience directly what was spoken into being with the first word, the logos, only what humanity speaks and makes with splintered light. Tolkien felt that the separation, the fall, was tragic, and that the splintering of light and language were the result of the fall. But he surely felt, too, with Augustine, the possibilities for beauty that derive from the felix peccatum Adi, the fortunate sin of Adam. Given light and language, it is our right to, quote, make still by that law in which we're made, and by the making to assist in the affiliation and multiple enrichment of creation, end quote. He felt just as surely also with Barfield that in the hands of the poets, the makers, the, quote, disease of mythology called language will be the instrument whereby subcreation will finally reunite word and percept, not in an ancient way, but in a new unity, and reunite humanity with the maker. He said at the end of the essay on fairy stories that, quote, all tales may come true, and yet at the last, redeemed, they may be as like and as unlike the forms that we give them as man, finally redeemed, will be unlike, like and unlike the fallen that we know. That, okay, listen again, right? So the power in language, which is why we have to keep telling stories about elves, right? Because they are the speakers, the ones who speak, shows us what we are as human beings in our ability to tell stories. Any world in which human beings live and live and speak is subcreated by their words and is thus a secondary world, right? And the glory of the multiplicity of languages is all of these secondary worlds that we create by way of all of our different languages. And this is both heart-wrenching and glorious, which is also what Tolkien is showing by the sundering of the elves. And why are there so many different elves? Why do they have to have so many different, I mean, just Quendi and Sindar, never mind, right? But you have all of the different sub-languages of the elves, because no one of them is the word that Iluvatar spoke. All right, we can never experience directly what was spoken into being with the first word, the logos. Only what humanity speaks and makes with splintered light, right? The splintered light is this glorious diversity in the good sense, right? This magnificent, fracturing and splintering of all of our different words and voices and stories. Our situation is tragic that we don't all have one language, right? It's like, and this, I'd say, is the truth of Christianity fundamentally, right? Christians speak all languages. That's I want to say a bad word to bring this point across, but it's the bleeping point, right? And this is me on my soapbox, I'm a little frustrated with all the gang warfare that goes on out there in the internet, and when people are trying to figure out which liturgy is the most perfect, and which language is the one that we should be speaking in, and which translation of the scriptures we're supposed to be using, and which one is the only one. Well, you're missing the point of the incarnation if you're focusing on that, right? Because you are missing the point of the radical. I mean, on the one hand, the self-emptying of God, and so as to be able to speak with us at all. But the fortunate sin of Adam is that we do speak in all of these different languages, and therefore, I mean, for Christianity, the point is translate the scriptures into every language. Keep translating and keep translating. You're never going to get the word God spoke, right? That is, it's hard to say whether we can even hear it, because it would be like hearing that first chord that Iluvatar proposed to the Ainur. It's not clear that we would be able to even hear it. We are in our embodied state, which remember was Tolkien's always, we are incarnate minds, and incarnate minds have trees of languages, not a single language. And the trees of languages express different things with different levels of, different kinds of beauty. The phonemes of one language express one kind of beauty, the phonemes of another language express a different. That it's this rainbow-hued, splintered light that in fact enables us to participate in the multiple enrichment of creation. And that, I mean, he does have this, he's obviously looking to the redemption and the hope that as man finally redeemed, we may be able to tell further stories, but we won't recognize ourselves as fallen in the stories that we are able to tell in the heavenly Jerusalem, with the new heaven and the new earth. So the image of this splintering is the image of the expression of God in the world. And the elves, in their story and in their sorrow, are that participation in understanding and wisdom and perception and light. Okay, how's that for a fat lesson? The main problem here is understanding this powerful relationship between the literal and the metaphorical, so that when you're dealing with something like the elves wake up by the waters, the elves come, the elves open their eyes and wake up by the waters, and that they're under the starlight and so forth, that these things are not going to be simply mapped onto truths. They are the expression itself is somehow the exercise in trying to express that truth. And the problem that we're engaged in is the one that Barfield pointed out for Tolkien and Lewis too, is this fracturing of our language into the literal and the metaphorical, which we are trying to recombine through our storytelling. I will let you absorb and think of that, and we'll learn more about Silmarillions in future episodes. Thank you for joining me. To be continued.